Hi everyone, this is the fifth lecture in Landscape Analysis and Green Infrastructure. I'm Elena Rybintseva and I will be talking to you today about the landscape management. This lecture is more or less based on the Landscape Management Chapter 14 from Foreman and Gordon. These materials are also available for you through the Blackboard. As always, if you have any questions about the readings, please email me. And we are also using part 2 from the book by Drumstad, Austin, and Foreman. And we are now looking at the practical applications of all the concepts that we have learned from the first few lectures. So we are going to look at a few case studies showing us what are really the practical ideas and practical applications in the landscape management and how we can better understand the pattern and the processes in various landscapes using this patch, corridor, and matrix model that we have been discussing now for several weeks. Landscapes around us are really products of a variety of different processes, and some of those processes can be natural, some of them can be anthropogenic associated with human impacts. Ecological forces or environmental processes include a number of different factors that can be reflected in the landscape pattern and landscape functions. So, for example, geological forces such as tectonic processes, hydrological processes, glacial processes, wind, weathering, they all are reflected in the appearance of the landscape. They all have contributed at very different temporal and spatial scales in the way how the landscape looks today. Soil forming processes represent another layer. Soils are a very important component of any landscape. And again, we can see the result of those processes in the way how the landscapes look today. And finally, biological processes are also contributing in many ways in the way how the landscape look. And of course, a number of anthropogenic processes as well. So as we are exploring our case studies and as we are exploring the nature of our landscapes and the nature of landscape changes, it's important to understand that the landscape is always evolving, it's always changing, and it's changing at a variety of scales. So far, we have been talking a lot about the spatial scale, but today I would also talk about the temporal scale, and temporal scale also can vary from minutes to thousands of years. So as we are observing various landforms and various soils and various types of vegetations that form the landscape, it's important to ask ourselves a few questions. First of all, how these landscapes have been formed and what was the role of gradual changes or series of various events. We can think about the evolution of the landscapes in terms of very slow, gradual processes, be erosion, runoff, or some very rapid events, such as a mudslide or a fire, or some anthropogenic disturbance that can change the landscape very quickly. And the magnitude versus frequency of these events is also reflected in the landscape pattern. Some of these landscapes can be happening all the time, or they can be happening very frequently. Others might alter the landscape just as one event because of its great magnitude. And finally, I want to emphasize the idea of the form function or pattern process relation. And we will be talking and coming back to this concept in many future lectures as we start moving into connections between landscape ecology and land use planning and urban planning. It's important to realize that there is a very strong connection between the way how the landscape looks, right, the form, and the function. And this is especially important from the perspective of land use planning as we are creating the landscape and we are creating different functions. These functions are reflected in the form. And this really builds on the idea of pattern process concept which is so relevant in landscape ecology. So there's this very strong connection between pattern and the spatial pattern of the landscape, the way how its patches, corridors, and matrix are interrelated and interconnected, and the processes that are happening in the landscape. So just remember form function or pattern process, as those concepts would come back very often in the future lectures. So why this form function concept is so important in landscape analysis and also in landscape and land use planning is that it really allows us to understand the landscape. We can deduce information about the processes that have formed the landscape from the forms that we observe. And as you go to your case studies and you are working on your project proposals this week, you can really explore more in depth this connection between how the landscape appears and what are those processes, either natural or anthropogenic, that have created this landscape pattern. Any action that results in changes of the landscape form also produces changes in the landscape process. Again, this applies both to the natural and anthropogenic forces. And finally, the third principle that I want to introduce is that alteration of one landscape component always results in imbalance in the entire system, leading into the changes in the entire system. So as we change some of the landscape elements, everything is changing, and then the entire system is essentially evolving towards the new equilibrium. So in landscape ecology, we primarily focus on the way how the landscape structure is affecting wildlife and plants, but also it is very relevant for the ecology of human species, for the human ecology. And if you think about humans in the landscape, we have also evolved primarily as an edge species. We spoke before about the interior species and um, edge species. And if you think about, the whole evolution of Homo sapiens and our ancestors, it's very clear that we have evolved as edge species, and even now we have very strong preference to very diverse landscape elements. We have very strong aesthetical preference to the boundaries within the landscapes, and diverse heterogeneous landscape elements offer the optimal living conditions for humans. That was true especially in the past. You think about the places where all ancient civilizations developed. It's always has been in highly heterogeneous landscapes associated with alluvial plain, with rocky plateaus, with mountain valleys versus slopes, with coastal areas, with riparian corridors, of course. We would always find those edges, we would always find those boundaries that are associated with human settlements in the past. And we also see this very strong preference to the coastal or other edge areas in our present preferences. And that just can be very easily illustrated with preference for the ecological borders, such as coastal living or any other landscapes associated with boundaries. The majority of the world today is living along the coasts, and there's a very strong migration from interior regions and coasts in the United States and China and Europe and in many other parts of the world. So it's pretty well documented in the literature that humans are looking for heterogeneity, and they're also looking for edges when they can make decision where to live. And we can see it both at the micro scale. If you look at the way how our subdivisions developed, there's a very strong preference in kind of creating those artificial edges in urban planning, and also development in highly heterogeneous areas. There is a very strong preference for waterfronts and mountain slopes and valleys and forest edges, backdrop of the contrast vegetation, just for the aesthetical reasons. And of course, again, we can see it at the macro scale, and we can also see it at the micro scale. So heterogeneity in the landscape is important. Urban landscapes are typically highly heterogeneous, both due to its original heterogeneity of the landscape, where cities were initially built, but also there is lots of heterogeneity just associated with human development itself. So heterogeneity and the pattern of urban landscapes are, of course, the result of human activity itself within sometimes already very heterogeneous natural landscape. There are many layers of this natural and geological, biological, and anthropogenic heterogeneity. Cities are truly the nexus of social and ecological heterogeneity and processes, and this is where physical heterogeneity can appear in cooler and warmer surface temperatures, in the vegetation structure, in different levels of species richness and different functions of introduced species, and as sources of or sinks of disease organisms, for example, or the vector of those organisms, or sinks and sources for different nutrients. Social and economic heterogeneity is expressed in things such as zoning regulations and housing prices and neighborhood regulations and patterns of investments, and of course the distribution, the patterns of green, blue, and gray infrastructure. So this is a case study that I would like you to watch on your own. This is a short video about downtown Ann Arbor, exploring how this urban heterogeneity affects human preferences of where they want to be in the city. So this is really helps us to understand how the concepts of landscape heterogeneity are relevant in urban planning. In our chapter, Foreman and Gordon is also discussing the major landscape types in terms of different levels and different degrees of landscape modifications by humans. And of course, today, we look at all the spectrum from completely natural to built landscapes. It's almost impossible to find completely natural landscapes, even in places such as the Sahara Desert or Antarctica. There is still some human impact that all landscapes are experiencing today, for example, due to climate change or due to some other global processes. But on the spectrum, we can look at the landscapes, from the most natural, and most of natural landscapes today are really natural remnants. So those are remnant natural patches or corridors within somewhat modified matrix. Also, then from there we can move to a little bit more modified forestry or silvicultural landscapes. So this is a combination of again, natural remnants and more and more modified patches, including forestry and some agriculture, some pastoral lands. If we look at the more modified next step, landscape patterns, that will be agricultural landscapes, and agricultural landscapes would include agro-pastoral and agro-silvipastoral. So agro, of course, stands for agricultural land, that this includes arable lands and also rangelands, pastoral landscapes, and then agro-silvipastoral would include silviculture, which is managed use of forest, and combined with arable lands and pastures as well. So this is kind of the next level of human modification, and then on the opposite end of the spectrum from the natural would be built landscapes that are entirely modified by humans, our urban landscapes. So within each of these varieties, we'll find different combinations of patches and corridors. Some of them are more modified by humans, some of them less. Even in built landscapes, even in urban landscapes, you might find some remnant patches sometimes of less modified patches and corridors. So let's just keep this in mind. And if you think about the landscape as a heterogeneous thermodynamic system, this is really important here to see what is the level of transformation of the landscape by humans. So landscape is a thermodynamic system run by solar energy. Everything that is happening on our planet is really moved by the energy coming from the sun. And natural landscape is an equilibrium system, right? It's in the homeostasis, it's in the state of equilibrium. So it's a resilient system, especially heterogeneous natural landscape system is very resilient. It can easily come back to the equilibrium after disturbance. The more the landscape is modified by humans, and also we spoke before about the heterogeneity, the less heterogeneous it is, the more kind of modified and homogeneous is the landscape due to human monoculture, the less resilient is it, and the more disturbing, the more dramatic, the more profound is the impact of disturbances. So think of this again, like kind of if you look at the spectrum from the most natural to the most anthropogenically modified built landscapes, the more landscape is modified by humans, the simpler is the structure, and so it's harder, it is less resilient, it is much harder for such system to come back to equilibrium after it is affected by disturbance. The ability of a landscape to come back to the equilibrium really depends on the amount of matter and energy which is removed or added to the systems. Again, think of a very well-developed heterogeneous natural forest. It's in its natural equilibrium, and compared to this, think of arable lands or think of urban settlements. The more energy and matter is taken away from this natural system or added, the more unstable it is. And so maintaining highly productive, high productivity equilibrium in the system has its cost. It has the cost of energy, and so this can be, energy expressed as either economic costs or social costs or ecological costs, and essentially the less stable is the system, the more energy we need to keep it at equilibrium. And this is true for any system. The same applies to political system, the same applies to our health, the same applies to the health of our planet. So just want you to think about this whole idea of a complex thermodynamic system that requires certain amount of energy in order to maintain its equilibrium. We can illustrate it with examples. If we look at this, very well-developed natural forest or maybe natural remnant of the forest, you can clearly see that this is a very heterogeneous, very diverse system. It looks very stable. As we move to this more disturbed area, you can clearly see that it's much more vulnerable. It's more vulnerable to erosion, to maybe some other disturbances, maybe disturbances by diseases. As we move to this more anthropogenically modified area with clearance, perhaps affected by some previous agriculture in this area, we clearly see that the system is even less stable. And as we move further to this more cleared area, you can clearly see the strong presence of humans here. This is even less stable system, so it takes more energy to maintain its stability. And as we go further, again, we see some examples of rangelands here that would be a little bit harder to maintain. And then we are looking at the arable lands, and you can clearly see that the system is even much less stable. See lots of open soil, obviously much more vulnerable to wind erosion and water erosion. And then as we go from here to this even more open, even more modified, and more also kind of homogeneous landscape through the agricultural, caused by agricultural development, we can clearly see even visually it's much more vulnerable, it's much less stable. And finally, as we move to the built environment, this is sort of the final point when the entire system needs to rely entirely on humans to maintain its stability. And so this is not anymore a natural system. There is really no way that it would regenerate on its own, right? The more we modify the landscape, the more energy it will take for us as humans really to maintain this ecosystem in the state where we want to see it. So those are just a few concepts from this chapter and from this lecture that I want you to think about as you are working on your project proposals. And of course, the project proposals are the central part of work this week. That's why we don't have any lab and we don't have any quiz on this chapter. I want you to focus entirely on how you can apply those concepts of landscape ecology that we have been discussing for your project. And once again, the projects are due October 16. Please email me or Zoom with me if you have any questions.